Welcome, everyone. We're here today to delve deeper into the subject of financial frauds, the main types of frauds to begin with, and then how to prevent them, and how to strengthen privacy using the zero-knowledge biometrics. As you know, frauds are common on digital channels, identity thefts, SIM swaps, account takeover, and many more, phishing included. The attackers' techniques are harder and harder to stop. To confirm the high level of attention for these frauds, we know that in 2020 there has been an increase in investments by Italian banks as high as 20% on channel protection. In the defense strategies and the anti-fraud approaches of financial institutions, a key trend in recent years has been to follow the PSD2 and strengthen the authentication of customers and employees through multi-factor authentication, known as MFA, passwordless and biometrical techniques, and SCA, strong customer authentication. Nowadays, one of the key topics in this field concerns the adoption of zero-trust biometric authentication methods that guarantee security and compliance to banks and their customers. We're going to discuss this with our speakers today. Luca Fresi, principal of Boston Consulting Group. Unfortunately, Fabio Gianotti, the CISO of Banca Mediolanum, could not attend because of a sudden sickness that prevented him from being connected. And then we'll give the floor to Andrea Carmignani. He'll be the first to speak. Will comment the acquisition of Keyless by SIFT, a California-based company, which is a very recent piece of news. SIFT is a unicorn in the digital trust and safety space, just like Keyless. And with Andrea Carmignani, we're going to comment on the news. Andrea, welcome, and thank you for being with us today. So the first question will be, who are the people of SIFT, and what are the synergistic rationalizations that will take place after the acquisition? Thank you very much, Elena. Yesterday, we joined with SIFT, a California-based unicorn. They are leaders in the digital trust and safety area. With a 10-year experience, they have an extensive experience in the anti-fraud sector, and through a system that processes up to 70 billion events per month. And thanks to their expertise, we think we can create very relevant and exciting strategies and also enhance our activity in the anti-fraud field, including more products in the range that we can offer on the European and Italian market. Also, we can be better in line with the PSD2, and that's also one of the reasons behind the acquisition of Keyless by SIFT. And also we are going to, we're focusing on the consumer endpoint, while SIFT has a big capability in terms of risk assessment and fraud prevention, in terms of the analysis of transactions from a back-end perspective. We see potential synergies and a lot of development strategies in the US and in other geographies. And also we will be able to be more pervasive in Europe thanks to our market footprint. Now, thank you, Andrea. A couple of words on Keyless. When were you established and how you developed, and how did you have you become a key player in the sector? Well, thanks a lot. The history of Keyless is very nice also for the Italian ecosystem. We were created in 2018 while I was attending an MBA in abroad. We established the the company in London initially with activities in Singapore. Then in 2019, we reshored to Italy, and we're now based in Rome. From an operational perspective, we have a team of some 50 people, and we have advanced cryptography and biometrics applications. So we are well consolidated activity, and that comes from our some 10 years of activity and collaborations with the universities, Lewis primarily. And we have obtained international funding and Italian funding, and also that supported our research and development activities. And in the past 2 years, we have developed authentication products. We have developed many partnerships with the main operators in the field of cybersecurity, and Microsoft, Cisco, and the main players in access security. And we are now certified. We were certified by FIDO and FIDO2. So that has made us attractive for many potential partners who have approached us in recent months in view of this transaction that we have now made with SIFT. Oh, thank you very much, Andrea. I don't know if there are any questions from the audience, especially concerning the most recent news, the breaking news. Feel free to send them to us at any time. At the end of the webinar, there will be a Q&A session. I'll now leave the floor to Luca Foresi, Principal of Boston Consulting Group, who will discuss financial frauds and the various types of frauds that target banks. What is BCG's approach in mitigating fraud risks, the holistic framework, and the items to be assessed in order to enhance the situation and security and priorities in authentications? Thank you very much, Luca. Well, thank you for your readiness to welcome me. As you announced, I will try to tell you about 3 things today. Now, first of all, the various types of frauds that come as a consequence of the development of the digital context. So the most frequent frauds, the main types of frauds, so how they happen and what we typically see in the market. And then as third bullet, we'll be discussing our approach to risk mitigation when it comes to fraud, taking a holistic perspective on everything that can be done in order to mitigate frauds and the typical actions that we recommend to our clients in order to improve their ability to prevent and manage frauds. As for the first point, we all know that digitalization has been very, very prominent on multiple channels with clients of any kind in industry in recent years. This is a slide that focuses onto the banking sector. Internet banking, according to Eurostat sources, grew exponentially in recent years and has kept growing. Almost 60% and over 60% of the people in the European Union, including every age group, including the elderly and children, use the internet banking systems on a regular basis. That is at least 3 times a month. So people who have a bank account use internet banking on a regular basis. At least once in the past 3 months. So on the other hand, we also saw the impact of the COVID pandemic, which boosted this digitalization, not just in terms of use, just to see your bank account passively, but also actively. We've seen out on the market a significant growth in terms of both transactions carried out via internet banking, as well as the sale on digital channels by the banking institutions. So we've gone from a generalized use of internet banking to a massive use of internet banking, not just to see the bank statements, but also to carry out transactions online. And now, the digital channels have now expanded after the inception of the COVID pandemic to the population that was not native digitally, and that were not aware of the fact that online banking could be an alternative to physical visits to the bank, or even any other physical channel, including brick-and-mortar stores. These people have started using digital channels much more often, but they are not well prepared to how to protect themselves when using these channels. All this has led, from our perspective, to a shift in risk. The risk has shifted from physical risk. You see on the left-hand side some indicators of the number of bank robberies, which are strongly declining. So the typical bank robberies to the bank vaults, the bank safes, are no longer so frequent as they were 15 years ago. So this is a phenomenon that we'll see less and less of, because the interactions and the money, so to speak, are no longer in the brick and mortar outlets, but on the digital channels. So bank robberies have declined, but we've seen almost a 100% increase in the online events versus 2019. So there was a very clear shift from the physical world to the digital world. Now, this being said, what are the main types of online fraud? There are two main categories, if you will, two main families of online frauds on bank accounts, on deposits. It could be phishing or the like, so the ability of the hustler to pretend that they are a reliable entity with the purpose of grabbing the credentials to access an account and authorize transactions. On the other hand, there's malware, which is not requiring any level of trust, but it will simply generate unwanted behaviors. The most clear example is the silent change of the recipient's IBAN during a bank transfer. So there's a malware behind the scenes when you're working on your app, and so the bank transfer will no longer go to the intended IBAN, but to the hustler's IBAN. So these are the main phenomena that we tend to see out on the market, so in association with online frauds, and especially phishing is very, very prominent and relevant, because it is mostly caused by the human factor. The main weakness when it comes to digital channel protection is the human factor, that is the inability for certain people to protect themselves and understand who the entity they're interacting with is, and understanding that there might be someone trying to steal their credentials from them. What are the three main techniques used when it comes to phishing? You have email phishing. We all have received several types and several ways of trying to phish via emails, but they are becoming increasingly specific and accurate, and therefore more dangerous, because we no longer see, as we were seeing a few years back, phishing emails in a very poor Italian, but now the hustlers have become very, very good at creating very credible and attractive phishing emails. And then you have smishings, that is, SMS is sent trying to present oneself as a reliable, as a trustworthy entity or person, or phishing. That is based on the ability on the part of the hustler or the attacker to change the visible phone number so that the smishing or text will come from the number of the entity. So it's very, very hard for a user to understand that the text message will not come from the bank because it will be in the thread of text messages that he or she uses to interact with the bank. These techniques are mixed together, they are combined to be even more effective in capturing the customer's attention and perpetrate the fraud. Let's now see how these techniques are mixed up and combined to make the fraud even more effective. As I said before, in the banking context, you need to have at least 2 authentication factors. The techniques here are exploited in 2 possible ways. First of all, there's a text message or an email sent to the customer, and the customer is asked to click on the link to go to the website of the entity that the customer would like to interact with. In this case, it's a phishing from Amazon. The spoofed website is similar, if not identical, to the authentic Amazon website. And so the customer will enter the credentials that he or she generally uses with the website, in this case Amazon. The hustler, the attacker, will access in this way the first factor of authentication. The second factor of authentication, which was a major step forward in terms of security, has been in recent years something that attackers have developed in multiple ways. The first identification is yielded through a text message or an email, a phishing SMS or email, and an access to a false website. But then the process can diversify. One of the ways in which it can happen is through a SIM swap. The attacker goes to the telephone service provider of the customer and requests a duplicate of the customer's SIM. And using a false ID, they will obtain it from the provider. So essentially, in this case, the attacker, the hustler, can receive the second authentication set of factors that the entity, the bank, will send to confirm the authentication of the transactions that the customer wants to do. At this point, typically, the client, the customer, will see the phone no longer working because the SIM has been replaced. And so if the cell phone is not working, it is probably an identification that the SIM has been replaced by another SIM. Another possible process consists of the hustler contacting the client or a customer on the phone. So the attacker will pretend he or she is the entity that the customer wants to interact with and convinces them to just communicate the credentials. And again, the bank number will be the number that the final customer will see on the display, so they will have no idea that there's a fraud going on. A third possible process also uses the phone. In this case, the phone is used to replace the device that was the second factor of authentication, such as the touch ID of the smartphone, with the attacker's smartphone. In this case, the customer's smartphone will be de-enrolled while the attacker's smartphone will be enrolled. So in this case, the attacker will have the access credentials and the second authentication factor in his hands in the form of his or her smartphone. Now, what is BCG's approach to mitigate frauds? Our suggestion is that one approaches anti-frauds in a holistic way. That is, focusing, of course, on technological aspects, which are key, of course, but also at the same time focusing on the capacity and capability to govern fraud prevention, and also on the key capabilities that the core capabilities that are necessary to minimize the impact. They fall into 5 categories. Prediction capabilities, that is, listening to the market, monitoring the market, and anticipating the latest types of fraud. And then prevention capabilities, that is, the ability to improve customer onboarding and transaction authentication with innovative technologies that will be discussed by Keyless, and then fraud detection capabilities, also using artificial intelligence and machine learning as innovative technologies that improve and enhance the ability to detect a fraud, and then the response and recovery capabilities. That is, once the fraud has occurred, the entire process to manage the fraud to minimize the reputational and financial impact vis-a-vis the customer. Of course, when there's a fraud, the impact is very, very high and it needs to be managed. And so the entity needs to be able to promptly manage the process to manage the event at best, to minimize the reputational impact towards the customer and the economic impact towards themselves. Now, how do we identify the areas to focus on? We do so using a benchmark with the main European institutions. We monitor the benchmarks and best practices in cooperation, again, with the European institutions, especially banks. We identify the weak links in the anti-fraud chain from every perspective, and we suggest the main actions to be undertaken in order to align with the best practices. Last but not least, let's discuss the priority actions that you needed to put in place if you're a client. Well, there are 5 of them. On the one hand, you need to enhance the capacity to make native anti-fraud products to make them available. So products that are anti-fraud by design, testing and challenging the new products on the market for their resilience to frauds. And then secondly, build red team capabilities. Red team in the cyber world, essentially, but we also suggest in the anti-fraud universe as well, which should continuously attempt to blocking and the attacking the systems of prevention and prediction, so that you find loopholes in the in-house processes. Then the detection capabilities need to be upgraded, and this is point number 3, by using, for instance, machine learning models which are available today. This would allow us to get over the static methodologies that are in use today and that are not ready to detect the frauds that exist today out in the market. And then leverage external threats is the 4th point, to monitor information from public sources or also from exchanges and info sharing with other entities and banks. And last but not least, and this is where Keyless comes in, strengthen the customer authentication capability. In particular, at the moment of customer verification at the time of enrollment, but most importantly, during execution using biometric solutions, for instance. Thank you very much, Luca. So essentially, the statistics are recurrent in the cybersecurity universe. We're told that 90% of attacks start with a credential theft. So that is a weakness. So that being said, when it comes to bank frauds and internet banking frauds, clearly enough, once they access the website using the customer's credentials, attackers are harder to detect. Although the anti-fraud engines are constantly active, but then attackers are good at also simulating the behaviors of customers. Yes, they have become very good at circumventing anti-fraud rules. They go by trial and error, they understand the rules, and then they bypass them. And then there's a constant evolution also. The phishing messages are evolving quickly, and that too forces everyone to keep up to date when it comes to prevention, detection, response, etc. Yes, that's correct. We have to keep moving, and we are moving all the time. Moving ahead, the most important thing is to never be in a situation whereby you are the weakest player on the market, because typically the hustlers, the attackers in general, will target the weakest bank on the market in a very opportunistic way. As a lion would do with gazelles. They would typically attack the weakest gazelle or the smallest gazelle. In this case, it's always a good idea to never be vulnerable, because then it's very hard to then regain customer trust once an event has occurred. Well, thank you very much, Luca. We're now giving the floor to the next speaker. It will be Davide Minieri, who is the head of sales Italy for Keyless, and he will tell us about centralized biometrics, decentralized biometrics, and how to stop attacks. Davide will tell us about account recovery, the implications of an expansion of the footprint of digital identity, and how to guarantee risk prevention without compromising on user experience, and how to avoid account takeover and SIM swapping risks. Well, thank you very much, Elena. I'm happy to be here. As we've seen in the previous sessions, there are several risks and attack patterns and attack methodologies that are quite recurrent. I have liked a lot the example that Luca gave with the weakest gazelle and the opportunistic behavior of the attackers who are trying to capitalize on what technology allows us to do in order to benefit from their criminal activity. Now, Keyless, as we shall see, is capable of making organizations who adopt our systems not the weakest gazelle in the pack, and to always have the leading edge technologies on the market at their disposal to counter attacks effectively. Now, last week during an event, I heard someone say, a colleague from a bank saying at one of your events, Elena, that we should try to reverse the fraud trends. Frauds are on the rise. We've seen that in Luca's presentation. Now, Keyless would like to reverse that trend. Let's see how. Now, who are we to begin with, and what do we do? Well, we are a company that has been very recently taken over by an American multinational in the field of digital trust and safety. We are developing a brand new technology on the market. There's nothing comparable to what we do. To, on the one hand, manage to provide reliable authentications on the one hand, and authentications that are as seamless and easy as possible for the users. We know that digital accessibility and, most importantly, frictionless access is key for customers, for clients and customers, and they are on the agenda when it comes to any IT updates. And we have a technology that allows biometric authentication. However, although it is a biometric technology, this is never jeopardizing the individual's privacy. We know that this is absolutely key. It's one of the hot topics as we speak. But we also know that the digital identity is something that is very risky and will become riskier and riskier moving forward. Now, someone might pretend that they are Davide. And if someone pretends they are me, I'll have problems because although I can reset my password, I cannot do the same with biometric data. Now, Keyless will try to do exactly this, doing biometric-based authentication without compromising the person's privacy and their biometric data. There are over 50 of us, and as Andrea said before, we have offices in Rome and London, as well as Tel Aviv and Singapore. We are recognized the world over, and we collaborate with the best players when it comes to security and digital identity worldwide. Now, I mentioned this before. I have explained this, but however, our mission is to allowing anyone to seamlessly access any digital service from any device, while keeping personal credentials safe, private, and under control. Now, we do believe in all of this, and this is the reason why we partnered with SIFT, that, as Andrea mentioned before. We are sure that if we could recognize not only the facial traits of a person, but also the person's behaviors, we will have a much higher degree of confidence that people can do what they want in the digital space. I don't want to take too much time in this with this discussion, but this is a key slide, and if you're interested, you can receive the slide deck. The slide here shows us some data from the most relevant observatories in Italy when it comes to cybersecurity. And based on the data, all the indicators point to a growth. The violations of corporate accounts are growing, credential thefts are growing, phishing and smishing attacks are growing. On the other hand, the numbers pertaining to these attacks are very, very impressive. 7 billion euro of damages caused by IT attacks in Italy in 2020. Now, I don't want to sound old, but that is the equivalent of a treasury bill. So it is impressive. and the trend is growing. So more and more you see a damage, the extent of the damage increasing, not only penalizing the companies, the institutions, but most importantly, the final customer. And this, and it's very important for me to highlight this, this is leading to a loss of trust existing between the customer and the financial institution in the case of the finance universe, but also more general, any company providing digital services to their customers. Okay, let's look at a case. This is a case that has been publicized. We do not mention the names, but we all remember just before the summer, last June, a major event that concerned public administration in Italy. Everything began with a vulnerability in the network, and that was the inevitable beginning of it all, but then also the theft of credentials that then led to actions on the network which in every way would appear normal. So the transactions would appear normal and authorized by the systems, but actually that was ransomware activity with the ransomware blocking the systems eventually. What we do and what can be done with keyless is to break this chain of attack, which is a very classic mechanism. Allow me to call it that way. So to break that mechanism by replacing the authentication based on credentials, which are based on knowledge, on an authentication which is not just a multi-factor authentication, the classic OTP with the OTP code, etc., but by instead using the only unstealable factor by definition, which is the biometrics of a person. Now, we do this by applying the latest cybersecurity paradigms, that is the zero trust authentication, which applied to our technology comes to what we have called zero knowledge. Okay, let me fast forward. This is what happens on a day-by-day basis. You have an inherent factor that is something that you are. Imagine a cell phone, a smartphone, which is unlocked by a touch ID, for instance, or a local biometric set of data. That works like a password. Of course, the biometric data will be preserved, but it will be no longer locally held on the cell phone, but it will be decentralized and made by the hackers, by the attackers who might get to obtain these and steal these data. We encrypt it in such a way that makes the data unusable by anyone, including ourselves, unless it is compared with the face or the biometrics of the person showing in face of a camera during the authentication process. The second factor in authentication is the fact that the enrollment and recording of the identity happens as a one step, as a process which is administered and managed by the company, which is not the case with local biometrics. If you do everything from your smartphone, well, the keyless biometrics don't work like that. They are centralized in third-party systems that can then use the data to restore thanks to the keyless authentication, the credentials, and last but not least, that there is nothing that is based on knowledge, because we don't believe that knowledge is safe, like a PIN. So what does zero knowledge biometrics do? Now, briefly, now there's a factor known as ownership, which corresponds to the trusted device. The trusted device being the device that is recognized by the company through an authentication taking place on keyless. The authentication is only happening based on the face of the person, and if that authentication is positive, the device will be declared as being connected to the user and trusted. No authentication for keyless cannot happen via device which is not declared and understood to be a trusted device by keyless. So if an attacker tries to replace my smartphone with his or her smartphone to carry out a transaction on my bank account, that's not possible, because they will never be able to declare their device as a trusted device, and because they cannot have the user in front of the camera of that device. The second building block behind the keyless technology is a number of deep learning mechanisms on the device, not outside the device, but on the device, to, on one hand, to extract the biometric data and template and process it so that it is irreversibly changed into an encrypted series of fragments, and also to use, on the other hand, machine learning in order to verify that the information and the face are real and live, that it's not a video, it's not a photo, it's not a mask, it's not a video, etc. And we can recognize that and rule out that type of identification. And last but not least, we have distributed private computation, or secure multi-party computation, which essentially is, simply put, a computational system, an authentication system which is distributed and decentralized, where every single node is never a single point attack. And also in a logic which is similar to the blockchain, how the blockchain works, if you know how the blockchain works, an approach where the risk is distributed, and also in case of breach into the environment, there will always be one factor missing, namely the face of the person. Okay, let me now explain how it works. This is the authentication process. The user accesses the website and enters the app. An authentication is requested, and the user will show his or her face to the front-facing camera on their smartphone or any other device. It could be their PC, for instance. The face is verified, so first of all, if the face is real, and on the other hand, it is verified that the device in itself is a trusted device, and that and therefore the face plus the device are scrutinized to see whether they are real, and then the device and the face are broken into chunks of information that cannot be reassembled back again. So they are encrypted, sent to a network where a consent and quorum mechanism will assess the various bits, and if there is an X consensus on the part of the various systems controlling on our side or the customer's side the data, then the authentication is successful. Now, it's key for me to mention that you don't have to remember anything when it comes to our technology, and also in a financial perspective, this makes it possible for the financial institution to get a better coverage in terms of users. And most importantly, it allows a customer, a user, not to have to remember anything or to have anything that can be stolen. Because no one can steal my face, essentially. And then last but not least, the fact that the device is a personal device of the individual customer, the device then falls under the person's complete control. Okay, let me move to the conclusion. The 4 pillars of the keyless technology is that, first of all, we don't need any specific hardware. Everything is software-based, and also a smartphone that was bought in 2017, low quality, will give the same user experience of the latest iPhone that has Face ID, or a Huawei 5, whatever, that has Face ID. So this is a plus compared to our competition. And it makes it possible to have a very safe and secure authentication based on the biometrics. The second factor is that, the second pillar is that there is a unique, a single enrollment that can be used everywhere. And the enrollment data can be restored on several devices at the same time, but it's always the same credential. Or if I were to lose my device or it is stolen from me, the device will no longer be usable because my face won't be there, but I can do a self-service reset where I have a brand new device. And the financial institution on their side will have the same level of security that they had with the first device that was lost or stolen, because they will know that that device is a real device that belongs to, let's say, me, Davide, or no other device that anyone has used, managing to demonstrate that it was the same as I am, while it wasn't my device. Then, in the third place, we identify the face of the person. We do not identify the ownership or the ability of unblocking a device that the organization is not in control of. And then, last but not least, in terms of privacy, we do not store any biometric data. That puts us in a very privileged position compared to the rest of the players out on the market, because in every respect, since we're not dealing with personal data that we store, the GDPR requirements are met by definition. So we are fully compliant. Let me skip to this last slide, I promise. Keyless has an ability, because the way it is designed and how it works, it has an ability to meet the strong customer identification requirements of PSD2 by combining the ownership factor with the adherence factor, so zero trust and biometrics, to make it possible for the financial institution, on the one hand, to simplify the approach to multi-factor. There are no codes that need to go from place to place, and also to eliminate the friction with the customer. With the PSD2 has made things more secure, but it has added some friction, causing people to become less and less involved in the use of multi-factor devices, which we're countering through our applications. And that improves the security experience, the customer-centric approach, productivity, and also it is easy to integrate seamlessly. Sorry about taking too long than expected, but that's the end of my presentation. We have 10 minutes for questions and answers. If you want to send us your questions, they will be presented to our speakers. I have a question for Luca. Luca, as Davide mentioned, it might happen that financial institutions adopted new security measures, as has been the case with the strong customer authentication, and that the attackers are much faster in identifying these than the customers of the bank are in understanding and learning how to use the new solutions, which are not so easy, so straightforward. So they might not be in a position to identify any abnormal situations and therefore understanding that they are being the victims of a fraud. So how do you think we could solve the problem, and how could we improve in security and also elevate the culture of people and pay more attention to the seamless character and simplicity of the procedures? From my point of view, there has to be a much higher focus on the market than we see today in terms of prediction. That is, the ability on the part of the entities to understand beforehand what are the new trends, so that the new fraud trends, of course, so that they can work on that front beforehand in terms of prevention and detection techniques. Understanding beforehand, as I was saying before, talking about the lions and gazelles, understanding the new fraud techniques that are burgeoning on the market, and designing and implementing technological and non-technological measures to prevent them and identify and detect them using, for instance, artificial intelligence and machine learning that make it possible to evolve the detection rules. So from my point of view, all of this would make it possible to elevate what you do above the rest of the market, and therefore be less prone to being targeted by the attackers, because the attackers will tend to attack where they feel they are most likely to be successful. So this is an idea of how to be better protected. And then what Davide told us about keyless is also very, very interesting, because at this moment it doesn't have any weaknesses that would make it possible for an attacker to think of how to circumvent protections and perpetrate a fraud. Now, with the measures that we have today, it is a multi-factor solution, but what we have in general today is based on trust and the ability on the part of the customer that, on the other hand, there is an attacker and not the entity they would like to work with. And if that trust element is not there, then the protection fails. So keyless is removing the human factor and the trust factor, because there's nothing to provide and nothing to remember. There are no more elements that you could transfer to the attacker, such as passwords, OTSs, or OTPs. And everything is zero knowledge based. So there's nothing that an attacker might want to get from a customer. Of course, the situation and the framework might change, but in this case, this works perfectly, and there will have to be an ability going forward to understand beforehand what is going to happen on the market in order not to be targeted by the attackers. There's a question for you, Luca. In your experience, is there any way to understand the silent change of IBAN that is perpetrated using the technique you have described? I think this refers to our discussion of malware attacks. Well, there are tools out on the market that can somehow, although not with a success rate of 100%, they can identify the potential presence of malware in the customer's device by, for instance, carrying out a behavioral analysis of the customer and understanding that the IBAN was inserted differently, contrary to what the customer would typically insert data, key in the data in the app. Typically, customers will take time to enter their data and make progress, and when the malware does that, that will be done differently from what typically a customer would do. And so, of course, these technologies are not fail-proof, but they are good at identifying the presence of a malware on the customer's device. Thank you, Luca. I have a question for Davide. Davide, you have presented very thoroughly the way in which your technology can stop the attack chain and to skip passages and steps that have become too hard to carry out. It's passwordless. It is bringing control back at the hands of the consumers, and it is compliant with the current regulations. There's a lot more, but this is what I have noted down. Can you give us an example of a real-life case of people who have used keyless and how the project developed and worked? Well, our client is a typical financial institution with a fraud detection system that analyzes risks in terms of what it does to the in terms of the transaction and user experience, and for instance, if there's a low amount of transaction towards a recurrent contact to whom or which they have sent like 10 transfers in the past 10 months, so then that will be classified, categorized as a low-risk transaction, and the entire authentication and authorization process will be simpler. In the case of more complex situations or not so unusual situations, the risk detection and risk scoring system that the financial institution has will add authentication factors, making the whole process harder, and hence the user fatigue or authentication fatigue for the final customer, for the final user. And then different levels, such as the OTP or the block on specific transactions. And so with this client, what they have managed to do before we came in with our project, they had been successful at stopping frauds, but as Luca said before, at some point, they realized that on the other end, the attackers were well prepared, and they were trying to understand the rules and how the mechanism was working in order to do something that could be perceived as a neutral, normal, regular transaction. Now, what this client is doing with us, in partnership with us, is undertaking a journey whereby within this mechanism of behavioral analysis, it's easier to add a strong authentication without compromising the user experience by adding the keyless feature. So every now and then, or when the transaction warrants it, the security level is dramatically enhanced when it comes to the reliability of the authentication, but without compromising the user experience thanks to the addition of keyless. In parallel, the goal and the benefits that they are seeing is that SIM swapping or account takeover risks, which may happen, for instance, overnight, with a clonation of mobile numbers and recording of devices. Well, this can no longer happen with keyless because I might receive an OTP, but I'll never be in a position to declare another device as trusted because the attacker will never be able to put my face in front of the device. And as very last benefit, in conclusion, the financial institution is now capable of demonstrating that their liability is much, much lower, if non-existent, because they can demonstrate that they have implementing a technology that requires the user's participation. And in case of incidents and events, it can be demonstrated that users have acted personally to make that event happen. And so from an accounting and financial level, that also is helping the bank because it doesn't have to have so many reserves to cover for fraud risks. Now, thank you very much, Davide. This is the end of our webinar. I'd like to thank Andrea Carmignani, co-founder and CEO of Keyless, Luca Foresi, the principal of Boston Consulting Group, and Davide Minieri, head of sales at Keyless, and all the attendees who participated in this event today. Thank you all very much. See you next time.